In the shadowy world of military strategy, the most devastating victories are rarely fought with artillery. Sometimes, they are won entirely with geography. Right now, tucked between the borders of Ukraine and Moldova, a quiet, ruthless operation is unfolding. Moscow has spent decades building a geopolitical dagger aimed straight at the heart of Eastern Europe, a rogue, unrecognized strip of land known as Transnistria. Garrisoned by Russian troops and sitting on one of the largest explosive stockpiles on the continent, this was Vladimir Putin's trump card to conquer the Black Sea coast. But overnight, the geometry of this battlefield has been violently inverted. Without launching a single offensive, Ukraine has turned Russia's greatest strategic bridgehead into the most heavily guarded open-air prison on Earth. How did a few miles of concrete and wire quietly paralyze an entire Russian army? The answer lies in a brutal masterclass of modern siege warfare, and a geographic trap that Moscow cannot escape. To understand the sheer magnitude of this strategic disaster for the Kremlin, we must first strip away the political rhetoric and look strictly at the operational map. Transnistria is a sliver of land, barely a few miles wide in some places, entirely landlocked between the eastern bank of the Dniester River in Moldova and the western border of Ukraine. For over 30 years, Russia has maintained a military presence here. Officially, they are peacekeepers. Practically, they were an expeditionary force positioned a mere 50 miles from Odesa, the crown jewel of the Black Sea and Ukraine's most vital economic artery. In the grand strategic design drawn up in Moscow, this exclave was supposed to be the western anvil to a massive Russian hammer. The doctrine was simple but deadly. In the event of a full-scale war, Russian naval infantry would launch massive amphibious assaults from the Black Sea, storming the beaches of Odesa while armored columns surged out of Transnistria to strike the city from the rear. It was a classic pincer movement, designed to cut off Ukraine's access to the sea, collapse its economy overnight, and bring Russian forces right up to the borders of NATO member Romania. But military plans, no matter how grand, are entirely dependent on logistics. And an exclave, a piece of territory completely separated from its motherland, only has military value if it can be supplied. For Transnistria, that supply line was the Black Sea. This is where the Russian strategy began to unravel with spectacular speed. The failure of the Russian Black Sea fleet fundamentally altered the geometry of the southern front. Ukraine, a country with virtually no conventional navy, utilized a swarm of autonomous naval drones and land-based anti-ship missiles to push the mighty Russian fleet far away from its coastlines. Russian warships, which were supposed to provide the naval umbrella for the Transnistria operation, were hunted down, trapped in their ports, or sunk outright. With the maritime artery severed, the Russian garrison in Transnistria was suddenly cut off from its only realistic avenue of reinforcement. The anvil was completely isolated. But Ukraine did not stop at simply neutralizing the naval threat. Understanding the fundamental laws of warfare, the military command in Kyiv realized they had a fleeting, historic opportunity, not just to defend against Transnistria, but to permanently suffocate it. What happened next on the Ukrainian-Moldovan border was not a defensive maneuver. It was the construction of a logistical cage. Over the past few months, the Ukrainian military has transferred significant assets from its Western Operational Command to the Transnistrian border. But they didn't just deploy troops, they terraformed the landscape. Miles upon miles of deep anti-tank ditches were carved into the earth, creating impassable chasms for any mechanized unit. Thousands of reinforced concrete dragon's teeth were poured and positioned to lock down every conceivable strategic crossing. Fields of carefully mapped landmines were laid down, turning the border zone into a lethal puzzle. However, the real brilliance of this barrier lies in its integration with modern technology. The physical obstacles are monitored 24/7 by autonomous optical systems, thermal imaging, and artificial intelligence-supported early warning networks. This is not the Maginot Line. It is a smart, reactive, and impenetrable web of steel, concrete, and silicon. If you look at this through the lens of traditional media, it is often described as a shield protecting Odesa. But from a hard realist, operational perspective, it is exactly the opposite. You do not build a wall of this magnitude just to keep a severely weakened enemy out. You build it to keep them locked in. Ukraine essentially recognized that the 1,500 Russian troops stationed in Transnistria had lost their operational utility. By completely sealing the border, Ukraine ensured that not a single drop of fuel, not a single crate of ammunition, and not a single replacement soldier could reach the Russian garrison by land. Simultaneously, Moldova, recognizing the shifting power dynamics, closed its airspace to Russian military transport. Any attempt by Moscow to supply its troops via an air bridge would require flying through either heavily defended Ukrainian airspace or NATO airspace over Romania. Both options equal immediate interception. The garrison is effectively under a silent, bloodless siege. Now, one might argue that the Russian forces in Transnistria still hold a terrifying trump card. Just 2 miles from the Ukrainian border lies the Cobasna ammunition depot, a massive Soviet-era storage facility containing an estimated 22,000 tons of artillery shells, rockets, and small arms. For years, Moscow has used this depot as a tool of psychological warfare, implicitly threatening that any move against Transnistria could result in a catastrophic detonation. But let us analyze Cobasna through the cold mathematics of military science, rather than political fear-mongering. Ammunition is not wine. It does not get better with age. The vast majority of the stockpiles in Cobasna were manufactured in the 1960s and 70s. Chemical propellants degrade. Fuses become highly unstable. Decades of fluctuating temperatures and poor storage conditions have turned a strategic reserve into a massive, highly volatile liability. For the Russian troops stationed near it, Cobasna is no longer an asset. It is a geographic death trap. They do not have the modern artillery systems required to fire most of these decaying shells effectively. More importantly, because the Ukrainian border is entirely locked down by pre-sighted artillery batteries and drone operators, any attempt by Russian forces to move armored columns out of the depot would be spotted and destroyed within minutes. If Ukrainian artillery were forced to strike the Cobasna depot to stop a Russian advance, the resulting explosion would vaporize the very troops trying to use it. Russia's biggest military asset in the region has organically transformed into an existential threat to its own garrison. This brings us to the human element of this geopolitical trap. The degradation of the force inside Transnistria is severe. While on paper, Moscow claims to have 1,500 peacekeepers and a local militia of 8,000, the reality on the ground is starkly different. The vast majority of these soldiers are not elite Spetsnaz operators or hardened combat veterans. They are locals holding Russian passports, underpaid, under-equipped, and utterly demoralized. They have watched the destruction of the Russian professional army on the eastern fronts through their smartphone screens. They know that if they are ordered to assault the Ukrainian fortifications, they are walking into a meat grinder with zero hope of medevac, zero air support, and zero reinforcements. Combat motivation in this pocket does not exist. They are hostages of geography, waiting out a war they cannot possibly influence. From a strategic standpoint, what Ukraine has achieved here is a masterclass in cost-exchange ratio. This is a critical metric in military analysis. How much does it cost you to neutralize a specific threat compared to how much it costs the enemy to maintain it? By utilizing relatively cheap static defenses, concrete, dirt, barbed wire, and mines backed by automated surveillance and a fraction of active personnel, Ukraine has completely neutralized a strategic Russian flank. They have frozen the board. By doing so, the Ukrainian High Command can free up highly trained, mobile mechanized brigades that would otherwise be tied down guarding Odesa and redirect them to the active, blazing fronts in the east. But the ripple effects of this static siege extend far beyond the borders of Ukraine. This brings us to the profound strategic advantage this situation hands to the United States and its NATO allies. For decades, the Western alliance struggled with the vulnerability of its southeastern flank. Moldova was always seen as the weak link, heavily infiltrated by Russian intelligence, economically dependent on Moscow, and held at gunpoint by the troops in Transnistria. But the geopolitical asphyxiation of the Russian garrison has fundamentally changed the calculus in Chisinau. With the Russian military dagger caught firmly in Ukraine's concrete shield, the psychological paralyzation of Moldova has evaporated. We are witnessing a historic, irreversible shift. The Moldovan parliament recently passed legislation replacing the phrase Moldovan language with Romanian language in all national legislation, a massive cultural and political middle finger to decades of Russian assimilation efforts. Pro-Russian political factions in the country are walking out in protest, but their threats ring hollow because the military backing they once relied upon is currently trapped behind dragon's teeth 50 miles away. Moldova is aggressively disconnecting its power grid from Russian-controlled infrastructure, plugging directly into the secure European Union energy network. Accession talks with the EU are accelerating at breakneck speed. Romania, a critical NATO ally, is rapidly integrating its infrastructure, logistics, and military planning with Moldova. In essence, without deploying a single American soldier or spending billions in direct military intervention in Moldova, the United States and NATO are watching the complete collapse of Russian hegemony in the region. The security architecture of Eastern Europe is being forcefully redrawn, not in the diplomatic halls of Geneva, but in the muddy, heavily mined trenches of the Transnistrian border. Vladimir Putin's grand strategy relied heavily on the concept of maintaining frozen conflicts to prevent former Soviet states from integrating with the West. Transnistria was the original blueprint for this doctrine. By keeping a small, heavily armed force in a breakaway region, Moscow could perpetually destabilize the host nation. But the war in Ukraine has shattered this doctrine entirely. A frozen conflict only works if the motherland projects overwhelming, undeniable power. When the aura of invincibility shatters, when your flagship is at the bottom of the sea, and your expeditionary forces are begging for basic supplies, the frozen conflict thaws and the geopolitical ice breaks beneath your feet. As we look toward future scenarios, the options for Moscow are grim and rapidly shrinking. They cannot evacuate their troops. They cannot supply them. They cannot order them to attack without sending them to a certain fiery death. The Russian Federation is being forced to helplessly watch its own soldiers wither on the vine. If Moscow attempts a desperate, suicidal air bridge mission to drop supplies, NATO radar and Ukrainian air defenses will see the aircraft the moment they leave the runway, leading to a catastrophic aerial defeat. If they do nothing, the garrison will eventually rot from the inside, collapsing under the weight of desertion, broken equipment, and total isolation. History is unforgiving to empires that overstretch their logistical capabilities. The silent, concrete wall surrounding Transnistria stands as a monument to one of the most fatal miscalculations in modern military history. Ukraine did not just secure the Pearl of the Black Sea. They engineered the slow, inevitable death of a Russian army without firing a single shot. The map of Europe is changing, and the era of the Russian exclave is drawing to a violent, irreversible close. The only question that remains in this grand geopolitical chess match is, how long will the men trapped inside the cage continue to pretend they are an army before they realize they are simply prisoners of a war already lost? We will continue to monitor the strategic geometry of this region closely. If you want to understand the true mechanics of global conflict, beyond the headlines, make sure you are subscribed. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Russia will attempt a final, desperate move in the Black Sea to break this siege, or is Transnistria already a ghost town? But to fully grasp the absolute totality of this entrapment, user must look beyond the physical barriers of dirt and concrete. The fortifications on the ground are merely the visible bars of the cage. The true brilliance of Ukraine's siege lies in the invisible domains of modern warfare. We must examine the electromagnetic spectrum and the brutal economic realities of this rogue state. For decades, the Russian garrison in Transnistria did not just serve as a physical threat. It was a highly active intelligence asset. Positioned perfectly between NATO territory and Ukraine, the exclave operated as a massive listening post for Russian signals intelligence, or SIGINT. Their radar arrays and communication interception towers were designed to monitor Ukrainian troop movements and NATO aircraft operating over Romania. Today, that intelligence architecture has been systematically blinded. The Ukrainian military has deployed highly sophisticated electronic warfare systems along the border, essentially placing an electromagnetic dome over Transnistria. The localized jamming is so intense that the Russian troops trapped inside cannot reliably communicate with their high command in Moscow without their signals being intercepted, localized, and triangulated. They are operating in the dark. A military force that cannot see beyond its immediate horizon and cannot securely communicate with its commanders ceases to be a coordinated army. It becomes a scattered collection of armed men waiting for orders that will never arrive. Then, there is the devastating factor of economic strangulation. Hard realist geopolitics dictates that military power cannot exist without an economic engine to sustain it. Transnistria is not a functioning state. It is essentially a corporate mafia, state monopolized by a single conglomerate known as Sheriff. This oligarchic empire controls everything in the region: the supermarkets, the gas stations, the telecommunications, and the politics. For years, the Sheriff conglomerate thrived on a highly lucrative gray market economy. They smuggled weapons, untaxed cigarettes, and cheap Russian gas through the porous Ukrainian border, amassing billions in illicit wealth. By heavily militarizing and sealing that exact border, Ukraine did not just cut off Russian military logistics, they completely choked out the Transnistrian smuggling economy. Overnight, the oligarchs who run this breakaway region found their bank accounts bleeding and their supply chains shattered. This introduces a fascinating psychological and political wedge. the local elites in Transnistria do not want to die in a trench for Vladimir Putin's imperial ambitions. They are businessmen, operating in the cold calculus of profit and loss. With the Ukrainian border locked down, their only remaining economic lifeline is westward, through the territory of Moldova and into the European Union. Moldova, backed by the EU, is now masterfully using this leverage. They are forcing Transnistrian businesses to register in the Moldovan capital, pay Moldovan taxes, and comply with European regulations if they want to export their goods. Moscow's proxy leaders are quietly, desperately flipping their allegiances. They are choosing economic survival over Russian military loyalty. Without firing a single shot, the economic siege engineered by the Ukrainian border closure is dismantling the internal power structure of the Russian exclave. The local militias know that the oligarchs who pay their salaries are already looking toward Europe. This realization drops the combat readiness of the Transnistrian forces from near zero to absolute negative.